OK, nous allons procéder avec la...
So we will now begin with meeting number 17 of the Board of Internal Economy.
Is minutes of the previous meeting of April 22nd. Is there any comments on that? It's good. Tout est bien. Ah, Madame de Bellefeuille et suivi par Monsieur Holland.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of small questions. We talked about House of Commons committees, and in the last couple of weeks, we've noticed some technological issues. In fact, they come up a lot with regard to interpretation, even at the House of Commons. Last week, it was hard to go from French to English. I mean, English to French, and this week rather, it was French to English. Do we know what's going on? Is this a problem with technology or any other issue? Perhaps Mr. Obi can answer that question for you. Mr. Obi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. de Bellefeuille, for the question. In fact, we looked into that in preparation for this meeting. Can you adjust your mic a bit? Yes, that's very good. Thank you. Yes. Yes, that's great. Thank you. But we can't see you. Oh, sorry about that. There you are. So, Ms. de Bellefeuille, in preparation for this meeting, we always look at our stats on the incidents. So statistically, yes, there were certain incidents in the last 2 weeks, but statistically, the number of incidents has gone down in the last 2 weeks with regard to the beginning of April. That said, this week there were technical issues in the House, also on committee. As you know, it's really hard right now for us to do maintenance on our infrastructure. We're working as hard as we can at night. So we're looking at solutions. We're trying to make sure the House can operate and committees can operate, but believe me, we're working on this day and night. That said, it's true this week, Monday, there were 5 or 6 incidents in the House, and there were also a few on Tuesday at the House and at committee, so more than usual as compared to the past few weeks. But again, we're working on solutions. We can only work on maintenance when we have time. It's hard. We do that overnight right now and on weekends, and we're doing the best we can. So, yes, we do have technical issues with some pieces of equipment. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I may, another question? More for Mr. Jeans. You had sent the whip's offices a note in response to a request by clerks to have virtual meetings and not hybrid meetings because some clerks are working from home. They're not on site. And at the Bloc Québécois, we've tried really hard to ask MPs who like to go on site to stay home because you asked us to do this. But as it turns out, the other parties didn't necessarily follow this advice. So when we asked our MPs to stay home, as per the request of clerks, but when we saw that other parties didn't really follow suit, it's really hard to get our MPs to, to do what was asked. So we really tried to do that. But I think that after the break week, I have a feeling some of our MPs are going to come back to committee to be here on site. Just want to let you know that we asked our MPs to do what you asked us to do. But after the break, some MPs will probably come back to be on site, not out of non-respect to the clerks, but simply to do a better job, because for them, they feel they can do their job better when they're on site. And I'm proud to say that we did respond to the call when we were asked to do so, but I just wanted to put that out there today. Perhaps I can just respond, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madame de Bellefeuille. Point of clarification, we actually did not ask MPs not to show up at committee. We simply spoke to the whip's offices, and we told them that we told our clerks that they could either work on site or from home. Many clerks do nevertheless show up on site to do the work, and others are working from home. But we're always there to hear from MPs, either virtually or in person in committee rooms. So next week is a break week. So a lot of committees will nevertheless be sitting. So we're talking with other services, with our partners, and some issues were raised in terms of resources. So we asked whips for some committees, again, because it's a break week, most MPs will be home. So whether some committees could sit 100% virtually with no MPs on site, this would mean using up less resources, and it means we could provide more services to everybody and to meet all of the requests. Oh, thank you. Well, you can count on our collaboration. Thank you. Thank you.
Followed by Mr. Richards. Mr. Holland.
Well, it's not on this matter. So if it's, I believe I saw Mr. Julian had his hand up. If either Peter or Blake had something related to this matter, I'll wait because it's on a different matter. So I don't want to interrupt the flow. If it's
okay, Mr. Richards, a different matter as well. Mr. Julian, is it on the same matter or a different matter?
No, c'est sur le même.
It's actually on the same point raised by Ms. de Bellefeuille. I just want to say that everyone knows we're in the third wave, and to have 100% virtual meetings, as far as I'm concerned, is a matter of health and safety in the workplace. So we fully support the idea that we want to expose staff as little as possible to these variants and to the third wave, which is actually quite dangerous across the country. Thank you.
To this point, yes.
I'll still stay on the list for my other items, but just
yes,
on
no
this,
problem.
Just on this point quickly. I supportive of the way the administration has approached this. They've given the option to clerks to be there in person if they choose, or to be virtual. I think people all need to be given the choice to do what they feel is safest, and it sounds like that's what the administration has done. So I'm supportive of what they have suggested.
Very good, thank you. Now we'll go to Mr. Holland, followed by Mr. Richards. Mr. Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So first on that point, I would concur with Mr. Julian full-heartedly that we, wherever possible in this third wave, need to avoid coming in. I understand that there are challenges for all of us, but this is a matter of public health and safety. It's a matter of the security and health of the people who work at the House of Commons. And it's a matter of risk of members traversing provincial borders. So hopefully folks will take that into consideration as we try to navigate through this global health crisis. But Mr. Speaker, I wanted to speak at this point, if I could, on a matter arising from the previous meeting, as noted in the minutes. In the previous meeting, we had a very lengthy discussion in camera with respect to the member for Pontiac and the terrible incident that occurred with a photo that was taken of him during private proceedings. I'm not going to have any questions for the House legal team, so my comments here are not in any way in camera. But this is a very troubling incident because it is. Let's start in the ways in which it's different than what we have dealt with before. We're all used to, in the thrust and parry of partisan politics, our characters being besmirched or having our ideas attacked. That's before we come into this place, we have an idea that that's going to happen. That's not what happened. This was a member of parliament who, in a private proceeding, made a decision to take a video or a picture and then share that image somewhere. That was an image of him naked. That image then was disseminated across the planet. We had a member of parliament and his family had to be subject to his image naked on late night talk shows in England, in the United States, in social media sites around the world because of that decision. The member of parliament in question, Sébastien Lemire, to date has refused to say where he sent that photograph or what his intent was in sending it. And that matters. Now, fellow board members, there is only one place that can adjudicate our own behavior. That's it. We're it. If this was any other workplace, when I headed up the Heart and Stroke Foundation, if an employee took a naked photo of another employee against the will of that employee and disseminated it, I can guarantee you an apology and walking away as if nothing happened wouldn't be the end of the matter. And I can assure you, no workplace in this nation would accept that as an outcome.
Monsieur le Président, je m'excuse, Monsieur le Président.
Apologies, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have a point of order. I do not understand. I know that this is a very important issue. I concede that, but we're dealing with a point on our agenda. I don't understand why Mr. Holland is bringing this up right now. We can talk about that in camera. Why is he raising this issue now during the public part of the meeting? We're supposed to be talking about it in camera. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask you to make a decision because we're not following the agenda. Well, this is an issue that falls under minutes of previous meeting. We let the member continue.
I'm not sure exactly how you would like to proceed right now. Would you like to withdraw and then come back and?
No, absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing that I'm saying that is that needs to be put in camera. The process of in camera is not to hide matters, is not to bury matters, is not to avoid dealing with matters. The purpose of going into camera is when there is a matter that is being discussed that cannot be discussed publicly. One of the reasons the Board of Internal Economy moved its meetings in public was specifically so the deliberations of this body could be seen by the general public. It would be a violation of that principle to move this matter in camera. There is absolutely nothing of which I am saying now or will say that is in any way needing to be in camera. And that is why I will continue. The problem that I have,
if I can, at this point, because we had determined that it was an item that was in camera, and it is.
I never agreed to that, Mr. Speaker.
If I can refer to our legal team to just comment on it, just so that we're not breaking any rules and make sure that we're within our legal parameters. Monsieur Dufresne, would you like to comment on this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what I can say is that when we were reviewing the items for consideration, it seemed to us that the discussion could touch upon powers and legally available avenues for the board to deal with the situation involving use of House of Commons resources, could give rise to discussion about scope and consideration, legal consideration about those powers. And these types of discussions could normally involve receiving or discussing legal advice. And as a precautionary measure, therefore, the recommendation was that this be considered in camera. The Parliament of Canada Act does have a presumption that the board meetings are in public, and it is only in stated circumstances that it is in camera. Those circumstances include matters subject to solicitor-client privilege and when legal advice will be obtained. The board can discuss matters in camera and make its decisions public after the fact. And if the discussion does not involve the giving or the receiving of legal advice, then it could take place in public. And it is also possible for a member to state their position on something that they would want the board to consider at a later stage. But it is really the matters covered by solicitor-client privilege that are have to be discussed in camera.
So based on what was just said, Mr. Dufresne, I just want to make sure that Mr. Holland can continue or cannot continue. My impression is that based on what you're saying, he can continue and it won't be an infraction.
If Mr. Holland does not disclose confidential information or legal advice or seek or share, then he can.
Mr. Holland, I'd ask you to continue then, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as noted, I'll be careful not to cross into matters that are legal in nature in terms of any legal advice that might have been given through this matter. So the situation that we are in now is in any workplace where a naked photograph would have been taken unconsensually of another employee and then sent out as an email, there would be action taken. And let's consider what reasonable action would be taken. Well, first, mens rea would need to be established. What was the intent both in taking the photograph and disseminating the photograph? We know that only about 2 hours between when Sebastien took this photograph and it appeared in social media by both Chris Nardi and Brian Lilly, that it was about 2 hours between when he took that photograph and when it appeared first on social media. So the question is, how did it get there? We know it's been well established that Sebastien Lemire, as the bloc has said, would have no relationship with these media outlets. And so mens rea intent is extremely important. Is this, and I would ask that he appear before the board in an in-camera session to answer what was his intention when he sent this? What was his intention when he took the photograph? When he sent it, did he send it to a reporter? Did he send it to another MP? Did he send it somewhere where he should have known that it would wind up in the public domain? It's entirely unacceptable for him to send it to a private individual. But if he sent it somewhere where he knew that image would be used for the member of Pontiac and sent around to humiliate him, then this is not an acceptable tactic. And I have had members from both sides of the House come to me and say, well, what does that mean for the lobby? You know, if I have got a red-eye flight and I come in and I'm in the lobby and I have a member of parliament who can come and take an unflattering picture of me with my shirt disheveled, perhaps my bra showing, or perhaps my underwear showing, that's now fair game. And what we're saying, as long as you say sorry, no problem. Imagine if this was a female colleague. What would our discussion be? Would it be a month later? Would a month later we be saying, maybe we'll do something about this, maybe we wouldn't? What is owed to the member of Pontiac? What is owed to his family? What lines do we have as an organization? At what point do we say that there are limits to partisan engagement? The naked body of a fellow colleague, I would say, is an absolute limit. And that today we're establishing a precedent for how such a matter is dealt with. I think that precedent must be expunged. I think the idea that a member can take a naked photograph of another member and disseminate it around the world is wholly and entirely unacceptable. We have to understand what Mr. Lemire's intent was in sending this message, who he sent it to, who that party then sent it to, if they happen to be a member of our organization, so that their actions can appropriately be captured, because that all speaks to the damages that were done, and frankly, the consequences that should be faced. And right now, the consequence faced by Mr. Lemire for this terrible action, nothing, not a thing. So I would request, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Lemire appear before this body in camera so that he can be appropriately questioned for the actions that he took. I think it is a minimum action that any reasonable organization would take, and we are the body that holds responsibility for that action. With that, I'll make a request officially that Mr. Lemire appear before this committee in an in-camera session to answer questions with relation to his taking and dissemination of that photograph.
Are there any comments or questions from the other members? Des questions ou commentaires des membres de la régie?
Questions and comments?
So, you know, I do understand the sort of the clarification we received earlier in terms of allowing Mr. Holland the opportunity to sort of speak to the matter because it was arising from previous minutes. Now we're starting to get into some debate and discussion about what would be the potential remedies and things like that. And I think we start now to get into where there would be potential during this discussion and debate about I don't know if he's made a motion to this effect or what has just happened, where we would be talking about, you know, sort of legal matters in terms of like even establishing the very precedent that we have jurisdiction here as a board. We could be getting into where there's questions that can arise here about asking legal opinions, et cetera. And I do believe that then falls under what needs to be in camera. So I'm not certain, but my suspicion is that now at this point, it probably is best to defer that to the in-camera portion of the meeting. But I'll seek some guidance on that. But okay. I'm just, it seems to me that probably that's the best course of action there.
Okay, so I just want to clarify, you're asking that we move this in camera?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that we get some better guidance, but I think at this point now, like because we need to even establish, like it's actually a legal matter to even establish whether we have even jurisdiction here, and there is a lot of questions that then arise that could, in fact, fall into what I think the law clerk was telling us would then be in the in-camera portion based on their decision pre-meeting that would be where that discussion should take place. So what I'm suggesting is not that we move in camera now, but that perhaps this be deferred to the in-camera portion where it was originally intended to be discussed, just because I think we do start to now get in, like Mr. Holland was able to make his comments because we weren't falling into the discussion about jurisdictional issues, legal issues, and a lot of the discussion that might now flow, I think, would be better fit into that in-camera portion. We start to get into some pretty gray areas otherwise, right? So that's what I'm suggesting is maybe we defer it until it's originally scheduled part of the in-camera meeting.
Okay, I have two more members, but before we go to Mr. Julian and Mr. Rodriguez, I believe I'm going to defer to Monsieur Patrice to just give us a legal opinion on what we're doing right now or where we're at, just to make sure that everything's in line.
Yeah, it won't. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It won't be a legal opinion because I won't speak in my capacity as a lawyer. But Mr. Richards raised a good point in terms of the gray area. So obviously, based on what the law clerk has previously said, if the board is of the view that it can have the discussion and made a decision on the motion that is presented by Mr. Holland without receiving, asking, or discussing legal advice, it can do so in public. If, on the other hand, there's desire or members who wants to have legal advice or discuss legal advice or receive legal advice, then the Parliament of Canada Act and the prescribed regulations and bylaws that were passed by the board then comes into play. And then should be proceeding in camera in accordance with the bylaws.
To that, because I think
Please
you still have the floor, Mr. Speaker. I know certainly I can imagine there's some questions that I would have in order to establish where we should be going with this that would certainly be legal in nature. I would suggest, and I would imagine others will probably be in the same boat because there are a lot of questions in terms of what we can and can't do that I would want to sort of have answers to, certainly, and I'm sure I wouldn't be the only one. So that's why I made the suggestion that that's probably what we should be doing.
Okay, I'm going to continue then. There's a fine line that we're stepping on here. I'll let Mr. Julian go ahead, then followed by Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Holland, as indicated, et Madame de Bellefeuille. Mr. Julian, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I listened very attentively to Mr. Holland, and I certainly have a lot of sympathy for his views and the importance of coming to terms with this issue. There's no doubt that there was a pretty profound violation that took place. But that being said, at the end of his comments, he very clearly stepped to the issue that raises a whole range of legal concerns. And so there's no doubt that any further discussion really needs to be taking place as was foreseen on our agenda in the latter part of the meeting. There are a whole bunch of legal ramifications, of course. Those need to be considered, and I think the direction that we've gotten from our legal the legal advisor to the BOIE is that we should be proceeding in camera to have that discussion later on. We do have a number of other items to take place that need to be discussed in public, and then move to the in-camera portion of the meeting.
Okay, we'll proceed to Mr. Rodriguez, followed by Madame de Bellefeuille, and then come back. We have some different interpretation here, but Monsieur Rodriguez, allez-y.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai l'impression.
Mr. Chairman, I have the impression that we're trying to complicate things. What Mr. Holland is asking for is simply that Mr. Lemire come before the committee in camera. We all agree that what happened was extremely serious, and it had a huge impact on Mr. Amos's life. In politics, really, there are boundaries, and this boundary was overstepped. Today, we're not having a legal discussion or a discussion on legal confidentiality. All Mr. Holland is asking for is that Mr. Lemire be invited to appear before this committee. We've done this more than once. We've done so recently. That is, invite someone to explain themselves before the Board of Internal Economy. So, Mr. Chairman, I would say that when there is a recommendation to go in camera, well, that's based on the rules of procedure and Section 3.1. Basically, what it means is that there is a meeting in camera when there are certain issues. Here, there are two issues. One is client-solicitor privilege or sensitive matters with regard to an MP's family. That's not what we're talking about here. All we're asking is for Mr. Lemire to appear before the committee in camera. That's all we're discussing right now. Thank you, Madame de Bellefeuille, followed by Mr. Holland. What I'm hearing is this. I would caution us all because the incident of April 14th was unprecedented. It's something important that happened, and we have to deal with it. I agree with that, but I don't think we should create any precedents here. From the start of our meetings, since I've been here, any discussion which is more personal in nature relating to certain MPs who may have violated the rules, all of those meetings happened in camera. I don't want to downplay what happened, but I have a lot of questions with regard to the potential appearance of Mr. Lemire. Mr. Holland said that we have to find out what the intent was of Mr. Lemire when he took and posted that picture. We're talking about legal intent here. The Board of Internal Economy is not a court. It's not up to us to determine intent or not. So I have a lot of legal questions, and I'm not saying that we want to hide anything. I would feel that if I was accused of that, I'd be acting in bad faith. That's not the case. But I really do not want this venue to be a political and partisan venue. I think that the way we're working now, which is to deal with important and confidential issues, including issues with regard to MPs and their personal life. Yes, Mr. Amos's personal life was affected, and therefore, I don't want us to create a bad precedent. I would like us to shed light on this matter in camera. As with Blake and other colleagues around the table, I have legal questions on the impact of Mr. Lemire's appearance. So really, I think the best way for us to deal with this is to deal with this in camera. We don't want to turn ourselves into a court. This would create a precedent. It might cause problems for us in the future. I understand what Mr. Rodriguez is saying. He's invoking these standing orders. But as we've said from the start, this is an unprecedented situation. This has never happened before. So I think that in the way we approach and handle this matter, we have to be careful and not create any precedents. So I strongly suggest that when we go in camera today, we can have a thorough discussion and air out all the ins and outs related to this matter. We can ask questions of our legal counsel, of the and of all the people who are supporting us. That's what I'm proposing. Thank you, Madame de Bellefeuille.
Paul, and I believe you had your hand up.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start with the intention of moving the proceedings of the Board of Internal Economy into public. The Parliament of Canada Act is clear that the deliberations of this body should be public. The exception that has been indicated is where we are seeking confidential legal advice or are having a discussion that would preclude the proceedings to be public. The question that is before us right now is Mr. Lemire going to appear before this body to be accountable for his actions, yes or no? Now, this body has answered the same question with respect to the actions of other members many, many times. If we're talking about precedent, even within the last year or in the last several years, certainly in my time here, this body has publicly said that it would have in camera members come before this body to be accountable for their action. Why? Because this is the only body that can take action. And certainly, I believe that Canadians have a right to know how we comport ourselves as a workplace. They need to hear this discussion. There's not an element of what I'm saying that deals with any matter that is legal. It is a very simple question. Yes or no? Should Mr. Lemire come before this body, as other members have come before this body, to be held to account for his actions and to ask him what his intentions were? Or are we not treating him the same as we've treated other members who have been engaged in problematic behavior that we've dealt with at this body? I think that's an important thing for folks to hear, because being in camera is not an opportunity to avoid public scrutiny. Being in camera is not an opportunity to hide from difficult conversations. It is a tool to be able to ask scoped and direct legal questions, of which none are pertinent to the question of accountability in the presence of Mr. Lemire before this body. So again, Mr. Speaker, I point to the fact that we have a scoped and direct matter before us, and that is the appearance of Mr. Lemire before this body, as others have appeared before this body, to answer for the actions that he participated in, and for that proceeding to be in camera.
Mr. Julian, before Mr. Julian, I just want to give a little synopsis of where I believe we're at. We have a motion asking us to request Mr. Lemire's presence in front of the board in camera for questions to find out just general information, to find out what happened and see what we can discover. And the issue before it comes to a question of the board, we do have two members that I've heard so far have some legal concerns about doing that. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't, well, I'm proposing that maybe we should go in camera to discuss the legal matters and then come back out and make a decision on whether to invite Mr. Lemire, and that decision is a public one. The legal matters, that the questions that can be asked, would have to be in camera. Does that sum up where we're at? Does that make sense? Mr. Richards, I'll let Mr. Julian go, and then based on what I just said, I guess Mr. Julian seems to have a question on this, and then we'll go to Mr. Richards. Mr. Julian.
The legal advice we've gotten is very clear. There are a whole range of legal questions that come up. Again, as I mentioned, I'm very sympathetic to Mr. Holland's concern that we all share about what happened and how best to deal with it. Now, there are three things that I think need to be brought forward. First, there are a number of other ways that this whole issue can be approached beyond the Board of Internal Economy, of course. That is procedure in House Affairs. It's the House of Commons. It's you, Mr. Speaker, as well. And it is the group of whips who get together on these kinds of issues. Mr. Holland did raise the fact that on financial issues, we have in the past called upon members to step forward and meet in camera with the BOIE. I'm not aware of any situation beyond those financial issues. The use of and where the Board of Internal Economy comes from is, of course, the administration and the administration of parliamentary resources. So I'm not aware of precedences around that. The third question, which is an important one, that Peter Milliken was so very straightforward on in his years as Speaker, is that the Board of Internal Economy functions as a board by consensus. That is an extremely important component of the board's function and the board's mandate. And Peter Milliken was always very clear that we have to look for a consensus on how to deal with the issues that come before us, particularly when it comes to administration of parliamentary resources. Those are all critical elements. I'm glad Mr. Holland brought this issue forward. I do think we have a number of other elements to consider on the agenda, and we also have a discussion that is already put on the agenda by consensus following when we move to in camera. There are so many questions, particularly legal, that have come up, and our legal advice has been that those questions be explored and answered in camera. So I would just suggest, Mr. Speaker, that the meeting proceed as planned.
Okay. I guess there's been another motion put forward. Do we have consensus to proceed with that before we go to? Now, I know we have Mr. Richards and Mr. Holland as well, who have a few comments to make.
Yeah. I'm I think almost completely in agreement with what Mr. Julian just indicated. So I understand, that your thought, Mr. Speaker, here had been potentially to go in camera to get the legal questions asked around just the appearance, and then come back and make a decision. But I think that's a difficult way to approach it, frankly. Mr. Julian has outlined quite well how there are a number of different potential remedies and different aspects to this that all sort of tie together. And I think it's difficult to make a decision about one part, potentially just one part of what the discussion would be. And I don't see how that would work practically. I think the administration has made the suggestion that they made for a reason, and I do think we do have a number of other agenda items which I think we would deal with far more quickly than we would with this one, and they have laid it out in such a way that I think it does work best for this meeting, and it also allows us to ensure that we don't start to get into areas where, like, it might be difficult to make this decision without getting into some of the other discussions about this matter. And there are a lot of legal questions that related, and I think there also are if you look at the Parliament of Canada Act that governs the section of the Parliament of Canada Act that governs what determines in-camera meetings, one of the other is matters that relate to security. And I think that when we start to talk about some of the things that we would be looking at in terms of following up on Mr. Lemire, those delve into that area as well. So I think we're getting into a couple of different areas where we would have difficulty in being able to discuss this without being in camera, even to follow the Parliament of Canada Act. So I really do believe that as Mr. Julian has indicated, we should follow the agenda that's been set out and recommended by the administration rather than trying to differ from that and deal with one piece of one item separately. I just don't think it makes any sense, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Mr. Holland, followed by suivi par Monsieur Deltel. Mr. Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think your suggestion is a good one. It makes preeminent sense, which is that the board can go into camera for the questions which are related to in-camera matters, and then it can come out of camera to deal with the matter that isn't belonging in camera. And let's be very clear: the matter of accountability and whether or not Mr. Lemire appears before this body is not in camera. That is a question of whether or not this body wants to take its responsibilities as it has in other matters. And to Mr. Julian's point, it is absolutely not just financial matters that this body has dealt with respect to other members. Mr. Julian will recall Mr. Weir. Mr. Julian will recall Mr. Kang. Mr. Julian will recall many other instances where we were dealing with the behavior of a member that was non-fiduciary, that had to do with their comportment in relation to other employees, people in their employ. The thing that makes this situation difficult is that this is one of our own colleagues who did this. And just as one of our colleagues did this to another employee, and that matter was before this body, this is unfortunately a situation where Mr. Lemire has done this to another member of Parliament. And we don't know if he sent this image to yet another member of Parliament who may also have participated in that. And we are the body ultimately responsible for that. And I think that I would hope that all members of this body, once their questions are exhausted in camera that actually relate to in-camera matters, would want to demonstrate that we are a workplace that does not allow this behavior. Certainly, we would condemn this behavior in any other workplace. Would we not want to demonstrate to Canadians that we did everything that we could reasonably do to ensure that taking naked images, private naked images of colleagues, and sending them all around the world, that's an inappropriate behavior? Certainly that is not something that belongs in camera. That's a basic statement of values. And what I've heard mostly today is the need to talk about legal things and go in camera. I haven't heard a lot about that principle. Mr. Amos is here today. He's listening to this. You know, there's a lot of time spent about why we need to go and hide this conversation. Not a lot of time talk about the damage done to Mr. Amos. So, Mr. Speaker, you have an elegant solution. We can go in camera. People can pose their questions as they relate to legal matters. And as is required under the Parliament of Canada Act, matters that are not in camera should not, matters that don't have to be in camera should not be in camera. We have a duty to make sure that those are public.
OK. Maintenant, nous allons aller à Monsieur Deltel, suivi par Monsieur Leblanc.
Mr. Deltel, followed by Mr. Leblanc. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pablo Rodriguez, my colleague, was right when he said we're complicating things. He's right because we were called here today at this meeting, part of which is going to be in camera and which will address this matter. So let's just follow the agenda. But what we're doing now is complicating things by trying to discuss a topic which raises all kinds of very important legal issues. The whip from the Bloc Québécois, the whip of the opposition, the whip, the parliamentary leader of the NDP, all of them have raised important issues which we need to address. Second, Mr. Chairman, we have to be cautious here. We have to stick to the facts. Mr. Holland drew a parallel with this incident and a person who would take a photo in the lobby of an MP who who might be taking a drink or might be looking disheveled. A lobby is a public place, but in a hybrid parliament, when an MP turns on his camera, the place where he is becomes an extension of the House of Commons. But if you're in the lobby, it is not an extension of the House of Commons, and with everything that implies. Thank you. Mr. Leblanc. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I was a little late for the start of the meeting. I was in the House. I was speaking to the opposition motion today. So again, I apologize for being late. But I've been listening to the conversation for 20 minutes now.
That I am entirely of the view of Mr. Holland in terms of the time we're spending now on discussing whether this matter should be addressed in public or not. I think Mr. Holland has made a very compelling case why this circumstance is extremely serious, and I think we should be in a public meeting when we would invite Mr. Lemire to come and discuss this in an in-camera session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, in camera or do the
I guess if I can go back to Mr. Julian, and the tradition here has been to have consensus with our decisions. And if there is no consensus, there is no decision. And I guess the motion is to invite Monsieur Lemire to an in-camera session. Do we have consensus to do that? No. I see as many heads shaking one way as the other, so we do not have consensus.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Holland.
I'm going to seek a recorded vote on that. I want that vote to be recorded.
One point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Julian.
Yeah, this is I mentioned Peter Milliken earlier because the Board of Internal Economy has a long history of consensus. It's only really deviated from that one time in our history, and that was a profoundly saddening moment around the BOIE. This isn't something, and we have a different function than committees, where on committees there are folks wear their partisan hats. There is no doubt that we're members of Parliament representing our parties. For the Board of Internal Economy, we are supposed to take our hats off, our party hats off at the door, and that consensus is absolutely essential. If we move from that consensus principle that we've always had as a BOIE, with that the singular exception, we're turning the BOIE into a completely different body from what it's intended, and a completely different body from what the Parliament of Canada Act directs us to do. So I am viscerally opposed to turning this body into a non-consensus body. I think, Mr. Speaker, you've made an appropriate ruling that we move now to the agenda. We'll have further discussion in camera. That's where I think we start to get the legal questions answered, and they are considerable, and then potentially move to consensus decisions on how best to deal with a serious and important situation that he's brought forward.
Just to clarify, mine was a suggestion, not a ruling, and I really am at the mercy of the board in what they decide. Like I said, the tradition is consensus, and that's what we're striving for. But Mr. Holland, you have another comment.
I do, Mr. Speaker, and I belabor this point for a reason, which is that I have not a partisan purpose in my presence in this argument. I have a duty leading human resources for our caucus to protect my employees and the employees that work for our organization, and to protect members from what the block whip has described as an unprecedented action. And let's be very clear, this did not happen in public. This camera was not on to the public. This was in a private session, only viewable to people who saw that Zoom screen. It is absolutely the equivalent of being in a lobby, only virtually. It was rendered public by Mr. Lemire. It was ripped out of private existence and put into public. And what I am saying normally, and I've spent many years here, and I absolutely concur with the idea of not forcing votes or operating on consensus. But at what point do we say, with respect to the matter that happened to Mr. Amos, that this crossed the line? At what point do we as a body say that, agreeing around a table about whether or not somebody should even answer this? Really, what's before us? Does Mr. Lemire answer basic questions in camera about what he did? That's all that's before us. And to say that that we're going to just go into camera and talk about that, there's no purpose to it. Either we are going to have a conversation with him or we are not. We've dealt with this in many other matters. And that is why I'm forcing a vote here. And I'm saying that I very reluctantly break with tradition, but I have an obligation, as I would when I was at head of Heart and Stroke, and there was an issue that came forward. I had an obligation to ensure that there were questions answered for an egregious action. I feel that I have an obligation here to do the same, and therefore I'm requesting that this be a recorded vote.
Mr. Richards, you have a comment as well.
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Holland asks, at what point do we make a decision? Well, at the point that we've been able to gather all the information that needs to be gathered, at the point at which we have asked all of the appropriate questions that we need to ask, and are able to make an informed decision about what the appropriate course of action is. And what we're all asking here, other than Mr. Holland, is that we have the opportunity to do that. To be putting anyone in a position to having to vote on something without all of the information, without all of the questions answered, and without the legal advice that might be required to do so, puts everyone here in a very unfair position. And it puts everyone in a position to vote on something they're not prepared to be able to vote on with all the information required. And what I think all of us are asking here is to have that proper opportunity to have those discussions, to get the legal advice that we're asking for. And so nobody is seeking to necessarily deny the request. It's simply to make sure we have the appropriate information and answers before us before we make a decision. So it puts everyone in an incredibly difficult position, and I certainly would agree with what Mr. Julian had said earlier. That is the way this board operates. It's the way it should operate, and we should all be taking our partisan hats off. And I think if everyone was to really look at that principle, they would understand that is exactly what everyone here is seeking to do. And I think to call for a vote when you fully are aware that people are not prepared to make a decision because they don't have the chance to have all the information that they need to be able to do that without having the in-camera portion of the meeting cannot be seen as anything other than partisan, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, and that's really unfortunate. And I certainly, it would put us all in the awkward position of having to make a vote that we would much rather be fully informed on, and make an unfortunate decision.
Very good. We'll now go to Mr. Julian, suivi par Madame de Bellefeuille. Mr. Julian.
Well, just briefly, Mr. Chair, again, this is a serious situation. Nobody denies that. There are serious legal ramifications. There are a whole range of questions that need to be asked. I don't disagree with any of that. I profoundly disagree with turning the Board of Internal Economy into some kind of majority body where we cast votes, and that destroys the spirit and the intent of the Board of Internal Economy. We are not here for this. We are here to establish a consensus, and we have worked through over decades through very, very difficult issues. Ultimately, almost always coming to a consensus. And so you as speaker, as the holder, the responsibility of those decades of consensus-based decision making, have the responsibility to not. If a member puts you in an awkward place by trying to change the intent of the Board of Internal Economy, you have that role of saying, no, this is a consensus body. There is no consensus on changing the agenda. So we move through the agenda as presented, and there is no consensus around this issue at this point. So we will take the time to get all the questions answered that people have quite legitimately around the legal ramifications. So ultimately, hopefully, we can come to a consensus.
Very good. The list is growing again. I'm going to ask one more time, if I can take Mr. Holland's word, the elegant solution of going into, and it's just so that you know, it was not my idea. We have some wonderful legal minds around the table who proposed that, going into in camera to ask the questions, to cover the legal areas, and then come back and make the decision publicly. I'll just put that out there again. If anybody would like to proceed that way, I'm just putting it out there as a possibility. If we have any objection to that, please voice it now. So are we okay? Do we have consensus before we go to that?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Richards.
That's kind of I know and I believe others were speaking to that very point.
No, I understand. I'm looking for consensus because that's normally how we do things.
Yeah, no, I understand.
And it is a tradition that I want to make sure remains.
There are pieces that tie all together, and I don't think to make a decision about one element of this, it just doesn't work. I don't think. I appreciate the suggestion, and I know you're trying to get there, but I don't think.
Oh, so we don't have consensus about going into in camera. Okay, very good. Madame de Bellefeuille, suivie par Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame de Bellefeuille, followed by Miss Petitpas-Taylor. Madame de Bellefeuille. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, as you know, since I've been a member of this committee, I've always looked for compromise. I've always also tried to be a mediator if there were opposing views on the committee. And in fact, I'm deeply saddened by Mr. Holland's request to force a vote, because I know that he believes in his mission, he believes in this cause, and he knows I know this, and he knows that I have understanding for his caring about this matter. The incident which happened on April 14th requires discussion in this forum. I don't deny this. However, I am deeply affected by the fact that he is using this committee for political purposes to make public discussions which all political parties here have already expressed clearly, which is to delve into this matter in camera. How will the chairman decide which aspects of the discussion are legal, which are not, which should be in camera, which should not? So we need to have an in-camera discussion. And in fact, today we were supposed to sit in camera later on. We don't want to hide anything. Everybody knows about this incident. Excuses were presented in the House. The Speaker of the House made a decision. Now we want to look into the matter more deeply. This matter is on the agenda. It's not that we don't want to discuss it here, but to ask for a vote breaks an important tradition of the only forum in Parliament which is nonpartisan, which is to remain above the fray and manage difficult situations. So we need to build on this tradition to deal with this difficult situation. Even if this is a serious incident, I'm not denying that. I'm asking everyone to please remain calm, because I wish to have an in-depth discussion about this matter in camera. I don't want Mark to believe that I'm trying to hide anything. Today, even given the nature of the incident, we cannot create a precedent which would impair the operation of this committee, which really until now has worked well. Even though in the House of Commons there is a strong opposition parties voice their positions, the government also voices its strong positions. This committee here is the non-partisan venue to deal with the most difficult, delicate matters. So please, let's all stay calm. Let's stop this discussion, not hold the vote, and go into camera as per the agenda so that we can discuss this matter as was planned today. We do not want to not make decisions. We too simply do not want to deal with this issue too quickly. So I would greatly appreciate Mark to change his mind and to not ask for a vote. I think it would be very unfortunate, again, to politicize this committee, and I'm sure it's not his intent. So again, I would ask him to please reconsider his request. We will move on with Ms. Petitpas-Taylor, followed by Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Deltel, and Mr. Julian. Ms. Petitpas-Taylor.
Speaker, I think a few things. First of all, I think we all agree that the incidents that happened on February 14th of this year have been extremely, extremely serious. And as Mr. Holland has indicated, if this would have happened in any other workplace, serious and swift action would have been taken. I think I've told you last meeting what my previous role was and how we would have reacted. And I think that for Mr. Amos and his entire family, we can't minimize what he and his family have been going through over the past month and a half. I take a bit of a different approach. I have to agree with Madame Delfeuille that I don't think that we want to provoke a vote here at BOIE. What we want, however, is consensus in order to move forward in inviting Mr. Lemire at BOIE in order to answer some questions. At the end of the day, I guess I really challenge all of the members at BOIE here to really rethink, their positions on this. Because at the end of the day, we want to work as a consensus body, but we also want to send the message loud and clear to our members, to all of our members, whichever party that it is. And I'm probably one of the most nonpartisan MPs that you're going to meet. But at the end of the day, I really want to make sure that this situation does not happen again, that our members of parliament know that they have a safe place to work, and also as the Board of Internal Economy, that we're taking this matter very seriously and that we get to the bottom of things. So at the end of the day, I just really, I plead with all of us, you know what I mean, to move forward, to come up with a consensus to move forward with this. I also believe that we could go into an in-camera session to answer perhaps some legal questions that people may have. But then from there, let's move forward in agreeing to the next step, and let's have that conversation publicly, because I think Canadians want us to have an effective and healthy workplace for all Canadians, and they want to see that we are taking this matter seriously. Thank you.
Okay, Monsieur Rodriguez, suivi par Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Rodriguez, then Mr. Deltel, and Mr. Julian. Mr. Rodriguez. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am troubled and a bit saddened by the link being made here with partisanship. Mr. Amos is not a liberal. He's just a human being, a father, a son, a husband. I would say the same thing about any other MP. What happened to him shouldn't happen to anyone, whatever party they're a member of. And this is the premise for our discussion, and not partisanship. He is, first and foremost, a human being, and his picture was taken and distributed, and his life has changed. Mr. Lemire admitted to taking the picture, the screen capture, and this is all the information we need to invite him or not. We don't need a discussion on all of this. I don't know what more you want. This is enough. Thank you.
Mr. Deltel, followed by Mr. Julian. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. the debate going on during this meeting is whether we respect the consensus or not. A consensus is a consensus is a consensus, full stop. There can be nuances when one brings a support, but it's black and white. You consent or you don't. And the reality, Mr. Chairman, is that here on the Board of Internal Economy, everything has already worked based on consensus. And I salute the expertise of the people around me. In June of 2015, there was a similar situation which arose at the Board of Internal Economy.
Le BRI a discuté des congés annuels et autres accordés aux employés pendant la dissolution. Comme il n'y a pas de consensus sur une modification de la politique en cours, le statu quo est maintenu.
Leblanc and Van Lode and Madame Ambler noting their disagreement, unquote. Alors, Monsieur le Président, un consensus.
So, Mr. Chairman, a consensus is a consensus. You agree or not? If some people don't follow that, please let me know. But it seems there's no consensus right now. Thank you, Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Holland, and then Mr. Leblanc.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So we need to decide how we want to proceed as the Board of Internal Economy. It's important. Everybody's saying we need a consensus. We have an agenda which clearly states that we can get answers to any legal issues raised about a very worrying incident which happened to Mr. Amos. Everybody wants answers to legal questions which will be raised. So I do not really understand why we are still discussing a change on the agenda where there's no consensus. I think would be a lot more productive, since there is no consensus right now, on switching around the agenda. So we can't start with the idea that we're throwing out consensus and asking for a vote. Mr. Holland, I certainly understand his point of view, and he's not the first member to try to force a vote on the Board of Internal Economy. But the chairman and chairwomen in the past and for decades have followed the tradition whereby if there is no consensus, we continue with the status quo. So we have an agenda, and there's no consensus to change the agenda on the one hand, and we will have a discussion, and our legal questions will be answered. So it's clear, Mr. Chairman, you have the right as the chair of the Board of Internal Economy to determine that there is no consensus to change the agenda, and so we continue as per the agenda. Thank you. We'll now continue with Mr. Holland.
I just want to make sure that...
I was deferring to Mr. Leblanc.
Followed by Mr. Leblanc. We'll go to Mr. Leblanc. And I just want to clarify, after checking, that consensus is a tradition in the Board of Internal Economy, and is a tradition that is very strong. But a forced vote, is also something that is allowed depending on what the board decides. Monsieur Leblanc.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just going to note exactly what you said. Mr. Julian and I think, had the experience, at least for some time, of being together on the Board of Internal Economy when another great speaker of the House of Commons, Andrew Scheer, was in your seat, Mr. Speaker. And I listened to my friend, Monsieur Deltel, and the Conservative whip talking about the importance of consensus. And they're right, the board usually functions, and that's a good thing. It's an efficient way to do business. But I also remember those board meetings where Peter Van Loan, who was then the Conservative House leader, or John Duncan, who was the Conservative whip, were very happy to force recorded votes, as were the Liberals, on a difficult matter involving the use of House of Commons funds for satellite offices. So If the board was having regularly recorded votes on a matter around using House of Commons resources for satellite offices, I would think the inappropriate distribution of an intimate image over the internet and social media that affected in a very, very significant way one of our colleagues and an enduring way feels perhaps more serious than what was the right procedure to use House of Commons resources opening satellite offices in Montreal. So if around that issue we had regularly had recorded votes, the board continued to function, members continued to work on matters important to the administration, the financial administration of the House of Commons. So I don't think it's a huge traumatic moment that we might take a recorded vote and move on. Parliament survived. Mr. Scheer went on to be leader of his party after he presided at the Board of Internal Economy during many of those votes. So, Mr. Speaker, I would just suggest that our whip, Mr. Holland, had a good suggestion, and we should move on to the agenda following a vote on this matter. For a group of people who get elected, we shouldn't be afraid of votes.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a bit of experience, but not as much as anyone else here around the table. So as far as I know, and I recognize Madame de Bellefeuille and her spirit of conciliation. I salute and recognize her point that consensus is a tradition on the board here, but it's not a rule. So before moving to a vote, and if we do so, I understand it would be breaking with tradition. So I'd like to know when the last vote took place on this committee.
Nous allons chercher de
Well, we'll find that answer for you. In the meantime, Mr. Holland.
well, followed by Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very comfortable, as I said before, with your solution that we go into camera. You have everybody ask any questions they want, and then we would come out of camera for this vote. There is absolutely nothing about the vote that should be held in camera or has any reason to be in camera. I would hope that after the questions are asked, that it would be a very simple matter and that we would operate on unanimity. I would rather not move a motion. I am just saying that if we can't get consensus for something as simple as Mr. Lemire before this committee, that I'm forced to do that. So what I will move instead, Mr. Speaker, is that this body go into camera to deal with this item, that at the conclusion of its in-camera proceedings, that we will come out of camera and have a public vote with respect to Mr. Lemire's presence. I think that should answer all the questions around the table.
Do we have consensus for that? No, I don't see that.
Okay, well then I will start with a recorded vote on that, if I could, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
I would seek a recorded vote on that motion.
Okay, very good. Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Richards. We're not. We still have some questions. Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would have to disagree with my colleague, Mr. LeBlanc, on his perception of history. There have been very, very few votes that have been forced the BOIE. The one exception, of course, is after a period of a number of meetings where there was no consensus possible. This is a discussion that has started. It's an important issue, fundamentally important issue. There's no doubt. It was scheduled on the BOIE agenda. We have time available for it. There are a range of legal implications, as our legal advisor has pointed out. There is no question that the way to proceed, the tradition, and the history of the BOIE is that we simply, since we have no consensus, move to the agenda as written, and that discussion, an important discussion with those important legal ramifications, can then take place. I'm surprised at the at what has transpired. It is a pretty fundamental shift in how the BOIE operates, and it is something that, as Peter Milliken was so clear of in and his interventions, both at the BOIE and also at numerous committees when he was called upon to testify on the importance of the consensual-based decision-making on the BOIE. Peter Milliken was always very clear. There are always some exceptions, but those exceptions need to be considered extraordinarily seriously and only over time. I would like the opportunity to have the discussion as we have as you have put forward and the House Administration has put forward on the agenda. We have the ability to do that. And I believe there are ways of coming to a consensus, and that always has to be the preferred road to take for the Board of Internal Economy and also for you as our presiding officer of the BOIE.
Now we'll go to Mr. Richards.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I again find myself in agreement with Mr. Julian here. You know, the suggestion being made now is sort of, again, I've spoken to this a couple of times. The problem with it is that we're taking one element of a discussion and pulling it out of the discussion. And it just doesn't work that way. There is implications to other parts of the discussion on this, and to try and pretend that you can pull out the one element and have a discussion about it and then vote on it and then come back later to where the administration has suggested we do, which is have the full discussion in camera with the ability to ask the legal questions, etc., and then make decisions about the matter more fulsomely. I don't see the logic in that. It doesn't do this important matter justice. And I noted the suggestions or the examples used by Mr. LeBlanc, I think it was, from previous parliaments where there were in fact some votes that occurred. What those we're talking about, if I believe I know the circumstances, and it was simply a matter of one party sort of seeking to avoid sort of being sanctioned, I guess, for what the board was finding as sort of wrongdoings. When you're talking about something like that, I can understand and appreciate why there might be a need to remove the principle that we operate by consensus. If it's just a matter of someone trying to sort of protect themselves, we're not talking about something like that here. We're talking about three parties all agreeing that we need to follow the suggestions that the administration has made, have a proper discussion about a matter, and move forward with the agenda as has been presented by us. That is very different than what those examples were, and to differ from the idea of consensus here on something like that, where you've got three parties all in agreement that we need to do things the way it's been suggested by the administration, and one party suggesting we disregard the advice we've been given and proceed to break up a matter into little chunks and deal with it separately, is not the same thing in any way. And so it puts everyone here in a very difficult position, because we all want to try and do this in the appropriate way, have all of the facts, make sure all of the questions are answered, and deal with it fulsomely. And we're being put in a position here where the expectation is to do otherwise, and I just think that's very, very unfortunate, and not a good precedent.
Okay, the proposal seems to be, and now I'll see if we have consensus, to continue with the agenda and deal with this item in camera, and then come back out of camera and make a decision then. Do we have, I see some puzzled faces. Maybe that's not the next, no, I see heads going back. We don't have consensus on that. Mr. Holland.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, of course, it would make no sense. And let's be very clear, I'm not going to put Mr. Dufresne, well, I mean, Mr. Dufresne can correct me, I'll put it this way if I'm misspeaking. There's absolutely nothing out of order for this body to go into camera, ask all the questions that it wants. Any legal question, any matter that has to be dealt with in camera can be exhausted in camera. And then we come out of camera and then we vote on whether or not Mr. Lemire appears before committee. There's absolutely no violation of, I realize we don't have consensus, I'm saying I'm moving a motion that we go in camera. People can ask all of the questions they want in camera. They can do, we can exhaust all the in-camera questions, and then we come and we answer publicly the matter of whether Mr. Lemire appears before this body. And I'll move that as a motion.
No, we don't have consensus on that. I see some.
I'm seeking a recorded vote on that, Mr. Speaker.
I think that's where we're going to have to go then, because we don't have consensus on that item.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Please.
Mr. Holland is. I understand the importance of the issue, but his throwing aside the whole approach that the BOIE must take and has taken for generations, and as Peter Milliken has so clearly lined out, he's a speaker that provided such great guidance for parliaments, both majority and minority. There isn't the forcing of the votes. There isn't the calling motions. There isn't the amendments. There is a different approach within the BOIE. And so I think what you're hearing from a number of members from the BOIE is the concern about how Mr. Holland is bringing forth this issue. It is not the issue itself. The issue itself, we are all seized with. It is an important one. There are important legal ramifications that we absolutely need to be asking questions about and getting answers to. But the idea that you can simply move a motion as if the BOIE is just like a standing committee is simply inappropriate. That's the point that I've been stressing repeatedly. And as our presiding officer, Mr. Speaker, you simply have the right and all of the precedent to say there isn't a consensus. Let us move to the agenda is written. And this issue, of course, is not going away. I think every single member has expressed the importance of it. We want to start to get to the next steps. And the way to do that is to have the legal questions answered. We got advice at the beginning of this meeting that those types of legal advice that is so important is an in-camera portion. That is the very clear guidance. We have it as part of the agenda. We don't force votes. We don't try to impose a majority view. We seek to come to a consensus on this issue, which is so important. It is even more important than in other issues to come to a consensus about next steps.
Okay, I'm just going to move on to Mr. Holland, followed by Mr. Richards. Mr. Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as has already been mentioned, that this is a convention. It's one that we all try to follow. Is one that is sometimes has to be deviated from. What we don't do is take naked photographs of one another and post them all over the world. What we don't do is in a reasonable place of employment, allow one person to take a photograph of a fellow employee naked against their will and put it in the public domain. What I don't do is accept, because we have a tradition of doing things a particular way, even though that tradition has moved many different ways in other instances, that this isn't important enough. Sorry, Mr. Amos. And the part that is really confounding about this is my motion is very simple. We move in camera. You can ask every question you want in camera. You can exhaust all questions to Mr. Dufresne. You can examine every angle of this. And I have a simple request on behalf of Mr. Amos and the offense that was done to him. On one request on the basis to demonstrate to Canadians that we take this matter seriously, and that is the very simple matter, after all of those legal questions have been exhausted, that we have a vote as to whether or not Mr. Lemire appears before this committee or not. Just as we did with, made a decision with respect to Mr. Weir, just as we made a decision with Mr. Kang, just as we made a decision with Ms. Ratanzi, just as we made a decision and other members. And it was very public whether or not they would be coming to this body in camera or not. And I'm just simply asking that that vote take place publicly so that we have a demonstration of the seriousness with which we take this matter. And yes, I'm willing to deviate from tradition. Yes, I'm willing to do what other members have done in this body before, and in exceptional circumstances, move it. It was Madame de Bellefoy herself who said that this circumstance was without precedence. If it is without precedence, then it demands that we take action that is with precedence. And on that basis, Mr. Speaker, I ask that we vote on the motion, that we go into camera, that this matter be fully exhausted, and that we have a simple vote as to whether or not Mr. Lemire will appear before us in camera or not, and that be public.
Okay, we have Mr. Richards next, but before we go to Mr. Richards, I just had some information given to me that we'll try this one more time, and just what's being proposed, and again, I'll need your consensus for this, that we continue with the agenda, and when we go in camera, we have a chance to discuss this further, and then come back out of camera once that's done, and then vote on the item at hand. Is that acceptable to everyone? So basically, we're continuing with the agenda. It shouldn't take very long. We'll go in camera and then come back out with a decision, or to make a decision. Do we have consensus? Yes. We will continue with item number 2, which shouldn't take very long. Do I have a consensus? We have consensus. Okay. It's not exactly, there's been different variations of it, but let's continue. Item number 2, business arising from previous meetings, or the previous meeting. Any items? Seeing none, we'll move on. Mental health and wellness resources and professional development for our members and their employees. Madame Laframboise, Robin Daigle, have a presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our submission today is to provide the board with information.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry?
I'm going to have to interrupt you for a second. Oh, sorry, was that Mrs. Daigle? Sorry. Mr. Richards, you have a point of order.
I guess with all of the extended debate that had occurred around that, I had actually had my hand up to deal with something related to the minutes from the business arising from the previous meeting.
Oh, well. I'm sorry. Okay.
I think I just got lost because of the fact that that there was such a long discussion there that flowed from the first person to put their hand up. So if you don't mind, it really is a brief.
Okay, we'll be very brief if you don't mind, but thank you for pointing that out. I'm sorry,
and a
Ms.
quick
Daigle.
question, if I can, Mr. Speaker. Just in regards from the previous meeting, you know, I had made the suggestion that we seek to, you know, have you send letters to Quebec and Ontario ministries of health to make sure that we can have vaccinations for essential workers here in Parliament. And I see that what you have done is written to the federal minister of health, which, you know, so be it, I suppose. But I'm wondering if you've had a response to that letter and if you could share that with us. Because obviously it's critical that we ensure that these workers who are essential to the functioning of our Parliament and our seat of democracy here have the opportunity to be considered essential workers and get their vaccinations, and so we can keep them safe.
Yeah, there is no response as of yet. Monsieur Patrice, no. Yeah, there hasn't been a response yet. Maybe we'll push a little bit harder. I'll instruct our team to push on it again. Very good. Now we'll continue. Madame Daigle. Excuse, Madame Laframboise, allez-y.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our submission today is to provide the board with information on the mental health and wellness, as well as professional development resources currently available to members and their employees, and to seek the board's direction on whether they feel that additional resources are required to meet their needs. In regards to mental health and wellness, there are currently several different venues to access their resources. First, there's the Employee and Family Assistance Program, which provides confidential and immediate support for personal, work, health, and well-being issues. This support service is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at no cost to members, house officers, research offices, their employees, and members of their immediate family. Then there are the services and offerings provided by the wellness team of the House Administration, including programs and services to support a healthy lifestyle and general well-being, and access to nurse counselors who specialize in mental health, coaching, and support, as well as referrals to external resources for health issues. The Health and Wellness team offers yearly lifestyle improvement programs, wellness webinars, and virtual conferences. If members or their employees require access to specialized medical services for wellness, such as massage therapists, physiotherapists, and others, they are often able to claim these expenses through their health care insurance plan. De plus, l'administration de la Chambre
Further, the House administration has offered MPs and their employees a certain number of training sessions on mental health and well-being in the context of COVID, including information sessions on mental health, webinars, and virtual conferences. Lastly, under current BOIE policies, MPs can use their office budgets to take part in workshops, conferences, and courses offered in Canada. Fees for the participation in these events are eligible expenses and might be reimbursed. Recently, certain caucuses have considered providing additional resources on mindfulness to MPs and their employees, and we are looking into providing that kind of session. If the Board of Internal Economy wishes, the House administration can propose this type of service to all MPs and their employees, taking into account certain factors like delivery method and available resources.
It's a number of training programs to members' offices, many of which are primarily offered by House resources with no charge to the MOB. In addition, members and their employees may attend external workshops, conferences, and courses and charge allowable costs to the MOB, such as language training, media relations and presentation skills training, and computer software training. If so directed by the board, the House administration could explore additional options for providing professional development opportunities to members and their employees, as well as additional resources. In exploring this possibility, we would determine if there are specific requirements for professional development that should be addressed through the House administration that are not currently being addressed, as well as how these additional professional development offerings would be financed and whether or not additional funding would be required. As such, we ask the board to provide direction on whether to explore offering additional mental health and wellness resources to members and their employees as a service provided by the House administration, and whether to explore changes to the existing professional development regime. Merci. I remain available to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Mr. Holland et Madame de Bellefeuille. Mr. Holland.
Thank you very much. And I just want to take the time to Madame Lebamfraz, to you and the whole team, to thank you for the additional tools that and support that you have been bringing on board for our staff. The staff of all parties, it is sincerely and deeply appreciated. This period of the pandemic has been particularly challenging for our employees, and these resources have been an enormous help in them doing their jobs and in them doing their jobs in an environment that supports them and is healthy. So thank you for everything that you've done. Two observations, and I know I've made these to you elsewhere. One is we've got work to do to now socialize everyone to all the tools that are available. So, you know, we're all going to have to take those on. And there are two areas that that I'm particularly interested in, and for the sake of scope, I'm only going to focus on for today. One is we have embarked on having mindfulness sessions for our employees across the country. We've already done a couple of days. We're doing that on our side, on the caucus side. I would commend it to the use of other parties. It has been a wonderful tool. We've had a great pickup and participation, and it's been a wonderful tool of wellness. So I would be interested. I'm very much vendor neutral in who that would be, but I appreciate you saying that you would consider exploring that as being something that's available to employees from all parties. And so I'm very encouraged by that, and I'll let that come back at another date and other parties to indicate if they have an interest for it, and perhaps you can canvass them. The one matter that I wanted to put specifically to the board today is in the realm of professional development. I had a look at the utilization of MOBs for the purposes of professional development, and it's almost nil. And it makes sense because the pressures on MOBs are absolutely enormous right now. And the last thing, unfortunately, that happens is dollars for the professional development of employees. If we want to go further than some of the excellent training modules that you have. This can be in conflict resolution. This can be in mental health and resiliency. It could be training in language training. And right now we're hearing from employees across the country of frustration that they don't have access to that, and that is a normal place of other workplaces. So my specific suggestion to the board, and we could do it on a trial basis of a year and then examine its efficacy, but particularly given the year that our employees have as a demonstration of our support for the work that they do and our commitment to their well-being and professional development, to say that we would establish $10,000 that would be added to the MOB that could only be used for the professional development of staff. And that those dollars would be, and I had an opportunity to talk with all whips about this, and that would ensure that employees across the country, with an average of 5 people working in an office, would have about $2,000 an employee to build resiliency, to build their strength and conflict resolution, to have additional language training. And so I think that would go a huge way as a demonstration of support for the work that they do. And when we're talking now about a performance a management system, typically a performance management system has goals, organizational goals that you set, and also professional development goals. That should be the part of any employee's development and goal setting. Right now, there are no dollars for that. And so, that I think is something that we need to change. And I would seek the support of other members to add that as an additional support.
OK, maintenant nous allons continuer avec Madame de Bellefeuille, followed by
Ms. de Bellefeuille. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to join Mr. Holland and say to you, Ms. Laframboise, that your entire team has provided all kinds of support and has been able to adapt to the particular context brought on by the pandemic. Your team, and I'll name Ms. Mercier, who is the HR consultant for the bloc, we had asked special training of her for mental health. That is, we're getting calls from constituents who are showing signs of distress. So employees needed to have tools and strategies to see if anything more serious was going on, if, in fact, some of these calls were not a call for help, or even if there was a danger of suicide. So again, we've had many calls from constituents who called into our offices, and our staff didn't know what to do. They were overwhelmed because they didn't necessarily have the tools or the skills or the clinical knowledge to deal with that kind of phone call. And I have to say to you that in the past, we had never received that kind of calls. So now we're getting these new types of calls from people who are in distress, who are very discouraged. So our teams need resources with regard to mental health to help them deal with these calls. Our teams also need first-line intervention techniques to assess how serious the level of distress is of the people calling us, so that we and our employees can provide them with more support than we normally would. So thank you very much. When you offered mental health training, you offered this training to all caucuses and about 60 people, MPs and staff who took part, including 26 people from the Bloc Québécois, both MPs and staff. It was really great training, and in an hour, everybody left 100% satisfied and equipped with the tools they needed to deal with this kind of call. So this shows that your organization is agile, it's flexible, it can adapt to changing needs and deal with the situations that our teams are dealing with, either in Ottawa or in our ridings. So I've gone on at length here, but I think we don't take enough time to thank you, because the work you do is important. That being said, when I read your presentation, I realized there are a lot of services that I learned about. Now, I'm the whip for my party, and I don't have the time to actually look at everything that's out there at our disposal. So I learned a lot, and my caucus doesn't know about some of these things. including the staff. So if you don't mind, I would love for you to summarize your presentation today so that I can let others know about what's available to our teams for free. And this will help us, again, spread this information within our caucuses. So that's my first request of you. Again, I don't have a ton of experience, not as many as some people around the table, but I've learned something and I want to rather communicate what I've learned to others. So if members of this committee agree, perhaps you can summarize what you've just said and we can take that information and present it to our teams. Now, I understand Mr. Holland's request, which is that within our teams, there are employees and on the Hill or in our ridings who want more training to develop in their jobs. And I myself do work pro bono, or did work pro bono for the Quebec Public Service, and we had a certain budget for training. So I have questions about whether we can talk about $2,000 or $10,000. I know that a lot of training is available for free, but I think that if you conduct a survey amongst caucuses on mindfulness, I'm sure that there would be uptake, and perhaps you can provide that kind of training to be paid out of the House's central budget. I don't see what Mr. Holland thinks of this. If it turned down this request, perhaps we can increase our riding budgets by $10,000 so that our staff can do some professional development. I think there's a need out there. I think it's justified to provide the training. I don't know about the amount of money which could be involved because we've just heard that there's so much expertise out there and there's a depth of knowledge, and perhaps you can develop some courses for the needs as described by Mark. So again, I'm not opposed to an increase in budget for training or other types of courses for our staff, but I think it might be good for us to know whether you have the space, the room, to provide different kinds of courses or training based on current needs. So I'll leave that with you, and I'll leave you with Mark's request as well. Maybe we could have $2,000 per staff member in terms of training. Then again, there's the question of whether it's warranted or not, but I certainly would agree to any kind of training in that regard. Thank you. Madame Laframboise, would you like to respond? Thank you, Madame de Bellefeuille, for your question and your observations. In Schedule C, there is a list of courses available and training available for MPs and their staff. And it's a very exhaustive list. It goes to office management skills, to the well-being of employees, and well-being techniques. So if anything else could be added to the list, sure, we'd be happy to look into it to see what else could be offered to employees, whether within the resources we already have or outside, and we'll find a way to provide that to you.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of questions. I guess I'll start first with the area of the mental health and wellness, and then I'll move to the professional development. The mental health and wellness on that front. I'm wondering if if you were looking at, and it's in the evaluation you've done here and I missed it, but if you were, it's a fairly extensive list of mental wellness initiatives that are available to employees and to members. But are there anything that you've identified when you compare that to sort of what would typically be available in either the private sector or elsewhere, that you would see as typical mental health resources that would be available to other areas of the private sector, et cetera, that wouldn't be eligible, that employees or members themselves wouldn't be eligible for, either by being reimbursed through their MOB or through their employee health plans, et cetera? Like, is there anything that you've identified that are gaps based on sort of comparable options available in, say, the private sector?
I can thank you for your question. I can definitely say that the main venues that we have. So if you look at the Employee Assistance Program, Employee and Family Assistance Program, for example, it is among best in class. I would suggest that from my experience, having worked in a variety of organizations in and outside of the federal family, the programs that we offer are absolutely best in class. So as much from the EAP perspective as the in-house services, having nurse counselors on staff, for example, is definitely a huge piece to our wellness piece. We do a lot of training, and we do try to stay above with the trends to always be to know what's coming up. The challenge obviously has been this last year. These last 14 months have been exceedingly difficult and have given mental health just a whole new world to work in, right? We're not just dealing with regular workplace events anymore. There are certainly organizations that are that can offer more. So, we have seen organizations that have perhaps bigger wellness staff, but I would suggest that the programs that we offer and the training that is currently available meet the majority of the needs available. That being said, so something like mindfulness, for example, we don't currently offer it, but it is something that we would be absolutely happy to look at. Mental health and wellness is an ever-changing field, and we do try to stay current with the trends to make sure that we can offer the services. I would suggest the last thing is, while we have some excellent offerings, the challenge remains access. So, we can say to an employee, you can get reimbursed for certain services, but through the healthcare plan, but then having access to your GP to get the prescription, and then after that, having access to a therapist or having access to other specialized services can be a bit more of a challenge. So while we may have certain offerings, access remains a challenge, not only for our employees, but for Canadians in general.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that question, because I think that's not just a problem specific to us. It's it seems to me like that's I hear that from people, whether it be constituents or other folks I talk to. That seems to be a general problem across this country, the access to those services. So that certainly isn't specific to us. So I do appreciate that. The mindfulness sessions that I don't know if there was other caucuses, but obviously Mr. Holland indicated that his caucus has engaged in them. Are those something that either the individual MPs that are being involved or have their employees involved, or the caucus through some kind of either House officer's budget or otherwise? Is that something that are being able to currently, are they being able to be paid for under parliamentary budgets, or how are those being conducted?
So sorry, we don't offer the mindfulness right now. It's being done separately.
Yeah.
But it's something
I'm asking
that
you, I know you're not the ones offering it, but what I'm asking
right.
is Mr. Holland has indicated that their caucus at least has in fact conducted these sessions. Have they been able to use parliamentary budgets to pay for those, or is that something that would be eligible under a parliamentary budget currently, or would they have to have?
I think that's probably a question directed
Mr.
at me.
Holland answer that
if you can answer it, Mark, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, we're utilizing it under. We have resources that we have that we're deciding to deploy to that purpose in support of employees.
Sorry, so those are parliamentary resources you're able to access now, or no?
My understanding, and I see, yes, exactly. Yes, that's true.
It is. Okay. I just wanted to know whether that was something that could be done currently or not.
Yeah, it can. And I guess my point on that is just like we're happy just to do it on our side. We've had a really a positive response using our House Budget's Office for that. But individual caucuses could do it as well. It's just a thought that it might be good thing to sort of offer across the board to all employees. We've had a really positive response on the impact for our employees.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Appreciate that, Mark. Maybe just on the professional development side. So, I know, and I would assume that other caucuses do this as well, but I know certainly within our caucus, we do provide a pretty extensive professional development for our members, employees, and members themselves. Different professional development training sessions, briefing sessions, etc. And I'm just wondering, first of all, if your survey of sort of the available opportunities that you've given us some examples here. Were those some of those robust offerings taken into account in that survey of what's available currently to members and their employees?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, caucuses are, and maybe it's unique to our caucus. I don't know. I assume not. I would hope not. But certainly there are a host of professional development opportunities provided within caucuses themselves through like, and you've kind of laid out some examples, I guess, of professional development opportunities. I'm just wondering if that's been factored in and taken into consideration in that survey that you've done.
So the list of course, sorry, that we have, that I have here, have not taken into consideration what the individual caucuses have prepared and delivered themselves.
Okay, and I guess what I think I was hearing from you was that you believe there's a pretty extensive list of things that are available now. I mean, possibly it might be a good thing occasionally to come to this board and seek suggestions for things that could be added to your list. But setting that aside for a second, I guess what I'm wondering is, like, there seems to be some suggestion that maybe we add a dedicated portion of the MOB for professional development. But I'm not clear on whether the issue in getting professional development opportunities to people is in fact a lack of financial resources available to members now. I would assume, given that there's an extensive list of opportunities that you provide that can be, in my understanding, charged to the MOB. Is there a barrier, a financial barrier to MPs to provide these things, or is it some other reason they're not being provided to employees? Like, I guess the question would be, how many MPs are spending right to their cap? And maybe that's why they're squeezing these things out. How many MPs are squeezing within $10,000 of their cap of their MOB? I'm trying to determine whether there actually is a financial barrier that exists or not. It may not be a need to provide more dollars to the MOB in order to facilitate these things. There maybe is another problem. So I understand the problem that we're trying to fix, and I certainly support the idea that we would want to try and ensure that professional development opportunities are available to employees and to members where needed. But I'm just trying to determine whether the way we're trying to solve it is actually we're actually hitting the right problem. So I don't know if you have those kinds of information, and if you don't, maybe we could get them. Like, how many MPs are currently squeezed right up to the cap on their MOBs, and how many are within $10,000?
So I know that we did take a look at that. My understanding is that that they don't all use to their cap. Robin, do you have any additional information? And I'm not sure if the CFO is on the line anywhere here, but I understand he was looking
I guess
into that
I can take that question there. So looking at the trends over the last few years, because obviously the last fiscal and previous are not necessarily typical years, but what we normally see as a trend is about 25% of the members spend more than 95% of their budget. So I don't necessarily have the 10,000 mark, but if you take 95% of their budget, they're spending within less than, I guess, $18,000 of their top of their budget, and that's about a quarter of the members. Then the rest would be still have, I guess, assuming some flexibility.
So yeah, we're not really talking about I mean, I guess it depends on how many are sort of in that what part of that range they'd be in, right? If they, if it's closer to the 18,000, but we're talking about less than 25%. Obviously, it could be 10 or 15%. So I guess I'm just trying to get a sense as to whether that's really the barrier here. What I think I'm hearing is it may not necessarily be it may be a barrier for some members, but maybe that's we all have to make choices about how we use our resources, and I guess that's no different than anywhere else. But it doesn't sound to me like it's a huge issue when you've got less than a quarter who are seeing that be obviously it would be a barrier in those cases, but again, it could be a matter of prioritizing, right? So I guess that answers my question. Thank you.
Very good. I believe Mr. Holland has a question or a comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, so I hear Blake's point, and I think when we were talking as whips around this point, one of the things that I said is that when there's not dedicated resources for something, it doesn't happen. And just as a case in point, right now, 0.013% of members' budget is used for professional development, and that includes members themselves. And it's when we talk to our employees, the reason for that is that there's never any discussion of the fact that those dollars would be available. And there are some great training modules, but the problem we have is that if a member wants to go deeper on language training, as an example, or a member wants to take a course on how to better to deal with difficult casework or difficult constituents, conflict management around mental health and resiliency, that there really isn't culturally anything we're doing to support that professional development of our employees. And given the fact that we've gone through such a difficult period of time where employees on the front line have been, really over the past 14, 15 months, subject to so much strain, I think it's a good idea generally. It's present in every organization I've worked in. I think it would be a wonderful gesture to show our support of our employees. So what I'm suggesting, Claude talked about $2,000 an employee. I'm not against that. I just thought it would be simpler to say $10,000 per office, dedicated exclusively for the purpose of professional development for employees. And the reason being is that there may be somebody who has one course that's $3,000 and another person is $1,000. And then my suggestion is we take a year, take a look at what kind of uptake there is. We encourage our employees to participate and utilize this. And if at the end of the year that we feel that was not a successful endeavor for whatever reason, then we can sunset it. But it's something that, at least in our conversation with our employees, would be very meaningful to them. And I think culturally would send a really important message about us believing in their professional development.
Very good. Not
so I'll move that for the consideration. If there's consensus on that, great. Or I won't.
Mr. Richards, you have another point?
Sure. Yeah, I hear Mark's point there that unless something is sort of dedicated, and we do have, of course, within our MOBs now there are dedicated portions to be used for certain things. You can so what the best suggestion here might be is, since I'm hearing that we're not talking about an extensive problem of every MP cannot seem to do everything within their budget. It seems like that's not the issue. It's just the idea of dedicating funds towards it. So perhaps maybe I don't know if 10,000 is the right dollar amount to start with. If it's 5,000, if it's the 2,000 Claude suggests, whatever it might be, perhaps rather than adding to the budget, we just dedicate a portion from within the existing budget. That would sort of deal with the issue of making sure something's dedicated, but not, of course, add to budgets. It doesn't sound like there's a need to do that in order to accomplish it. So it's just a matter of, as Mark said, dedicating funds towards it. So perhaps we whether it be a percentage of the budget, whether it be a dollar figure, however we want to do it, perhaps we do it that way, where we just make the suggestion that is it $5,000? Is it 1%? Whatever it is, be dedicated from the existing budget towards professional development.
Very good. I'm looking at the time. We're past our 1 o'clock. Do we want to extend the session? I think there's a certain interest in this item in particular, but we also have other items as we get closer to QP. Is there any consensus on what we want to do with this session, being 1 o'clock?
To allow this
Can we
discussion
extend
to finish,
to what point for this item? I'm
just for
hearing.
this item, yeah.
Okay, and then the others.
Just for this item?
Yeah.
Just for this item, and then the others we'll take up when we come back. Very good. Madame de Bellefeuille, suivie par Monsieur Holland.
Madame de Bellefeuille, followed by Mr. Holland. Mr. Chairman, I did not want us to leave and not to follow up on what Mr. Holland had proposed. I think it's an interesting proposal. I am not opposed to spend a bit of extra money outside of our budgets on these things, quite honestly. If we were to take the funding out of our budgets, I don't quite agree with that because we've already made our forecasts for the year. And what Mr. Holland is proposing is a great compromise. So if we all agree and if Mr. Paquette can show us that it's doable, we could add a fund dedicated to the professional development of our employees as of this fiscal year. We can follow up on how the budget was spent, what type of training has been taken. Then we'll assess in order to make more enlightened decisions in light of budgets available and so on and so forth. So informed decisions for the next fiscal year. So in the meantime, let's be there for our employees. They're living through a very tough time, an unprecedented time. So we'll take this year, which started on April 1st last, with money from our operating budgets to support our employees in their new work challenges. So we can consider this as a pilot project, if you will, assess at the end of the year to see whether needs have been met. I think that's the right solution. So again, this quote-unquote pilot project is a good approach, and then we'll see if we can repeat the exercise next year. It's a good compromise, and we'll see whether it will have met the needs of our employees. So I support what Mr. Holland said.
Mr. Holland?
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I totally agree with Claude. I think that if we scale back members' existing budgets, that's going to come as a major shock to members to suddenly find out they have less money. The second point is for a lot of members who go up to that 95% mark, they do so because they're in ridings where constituency offices are much more expensive or staff are much more expensive. So people in certain metropolitan areas have much greater strain. And while we have some provision for that, we don't really have a lot to compensate for the fact if you're in downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, or in other environments, there's a lot of extra costs. So what we would be doing, in effect, is saying that professional development would only be available for some offices. I like the idea of doing it, as Claude has suggested, on a temporary basis. We do it for this fiscal. We review it next. We see what the uptake is, and so yeah, I would support what Claude just said.
Mr. Richards.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not opposed to the idea here, as I think I've indicated already. I like, and it's something that I know I certainly do within my office. And I think it's a great thing for others to do. I'm also aware that as employers, we make our own decisions, and I sort of hate the idea that we start to get prescriptive about how people spend. I like the idea of enabling this, and I even don't mind the idea of dedicating funds. But I think we start to say, okay, we're going to add this much to budgets for this, and then what comes next, right? So it starts to become where we're getting very prescriptive about how people spend, and all MPs make decisions accordingly. Like, for example, we have a dedicated portion of our budgets that is allowed for advertising now. I choose to not. I don't advertise. I don't spend that money. I believe there's better ways to utilize my MOB. Others make a different decision, and that's fine. But I just don't like the idea where we start to get into dedicating a bunch of things for. So I like the idea of professional development. I don't mind the idea of considering setting aside because I agree sometimes if it's not set aside, then it doesn't get used for something. But I don't like sort of here's a pool for this and here's a pool for that. So my thinking is I maybe just don't have quite enough information at this point, and I understand where Mark's coming from with people in areas where constituency leases are high, or large ridings where they have to have more than one office and things like that. And often the people that are spending to the cap, that is why they're doing it. And if that's the problem, perhaps we need to look at that and whether those supplements for some of those areas are done appropriately or in the right way. So my suggestion would be I would like to just get a bit more information before I would make a decision on this. I know the 25% that are more than 95%, could we break that down a little better? How many are actually within $5,000 of their cap? How many are within 10,000 of their cap? So we have some sense of what we're talking about there. But I'm not suggesting I'm opposed. I just don't think I have quite enough information to make the decision that I would want to add to MP's budgets at this point.
Mr. Holland.
My apologies, Mr. Chair. I thought when we spoke as whips, I thought I misunderstood. I thought we were closer to consent than we were. So what I'll do then is withdraw the item and go back and we'll have a conversation among whips and try to answer Blake's questions and return with this item once we have consensus.
That's good. If there's no more comments on that, that was going to be part of my understanding of the consensus. Basically, we're basically instructing HR to explore the offerings of additional health and wellness resources to its members and the employees as well of the House and administration. And we're also directing them to explore changes to existing professional development regimes. I was going to add as well that they consult with whips to see what they're looking for so that we can have those options when we return to make a decision. Do we have consensus on that? Does that make sense? Oh, Mr. Richards, you have a comment?
Just one quick comment, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, certainly. Like we did, there was. I had a very brief conversation with Mark about this, and certainly, as I indicated here at this meeting, think it's a good discussion to have, and I'm supportive of the idea of making sure that professional development is provided. But we never did get into any detail, and so happy to do that. But I would still ask that the information I've just asked for would be helpful to me in knowing kind of what I think would be the appropriate way to approach that. So if we could still ask that administration provide that information about how many MPs are spending right to the cap, how many are within $5,000, and how many are within $10,000 of the cap. That would be very helpful to me.
We have that request on the record, and it will be brought to the House or brought to the board. Madame de Bellefeuille, vous avez une question ou commentaire?
Madame de Bellefeuille. Mr. Chairman, if I may, a final intervention on this topic. If you allow human resources to do that analysis as requested by Blake, let's just not take the last year as a reference year because it's not a real year, so to speak, because of the pandemic. We spent less money in some areas than in others. So maybe more years can be taken into account for the analysis. I think it'll yield better results. Thank you. Good point. So if there are no questions anymore, direction has been given. So we'll adjourn for today. And we will resume with the agenda at our next meeting. Thank you very much.